Okay, folks, in this unit, we're not going to do sequential chapters. It's not 16 and 17, it's 16 and 19. Um, 16 is lymphatic system, like you can see, 19 is respiratory system, 17 and 18 are digestive system and nutrition. So I just put those together. And so that's why this looks weird on your schedule to have 16 and 19, but that's what will be in this next unit. Probably, I would guess, of all of the systems of the body, an A&P student coming into this course knows the least about lymphatic system, possibly. Do you think I'm right? Most of you kind of don't really know what the lymphatic system is that much. So this is a real important chapter because of that. You're going to learn what the lymphatic system actually is. But it's structurally, it's a bunch of vessels that are very similar in structure to your veins, but they don't carry blood. They carry another very important body fluid called lymph. And in the last unit, when we were talking about blood flow in the body, and as blood moved into capillary beds, remember how a lot of the water component was lost out of the capillary beds to the cells, to the tissues around the cells, and then substances were dissolved in that water that was lost, like oxygen, glucose, things that the cells need. And then a bulk of that came back into the capillary, carried the water, carrying with it CO2 and urea, things from the cells. But about 10% did not. And that 10% has got to go somewhere. And where it goes is into a lymphatic vessel. So, one of its roles, the big one we're going to talk about today, is that of draining your fluids of any excess, or draining your tissues of any excess fluids. Okay, and so we'll look at that movement. Okay, another function of the lymphatic system that we'll see more when we get to the digestive system in the next unit, we'll see that you have a digestive tract that absorbs a lot of nutrients from the foods that you eat. Most everything is absorbed directly into the blood, except for fats. They're absorbed into lymph vessels. Okay, but lymph vessels ultimately carry lymph to the bloodstream, so it all makes its way to the blood. So we'll see that today. All right, and then another role of the lymphatic system is in body defense. And this is probably the one that your lymphatic system is most famous for. You ever heard of immunity and your immune system? That is the lymphatic system. It's just the lymphatic system has other jobs besides that of immunity. Okay? All right, and so the last half of this chapter we'll be talking about body defense mechanisms, and immunity is a part of that. Okay? All right, and so if we look at it structurally, you can see here these green vessels are various lymph vessels of the body. Of course, there are a lot more than is shown there because a lot of them are microscopic, but they pretty much parallel your blood vessels. So if you have an artery and a vein, there's going to be a lymph vessel there too. They pretty much parallel that. Along the way, the lymph, which is the name of the fluid in a lymph vessel, it drains through these little organs called lymph nodes, and they're basically there to filter the lymph of anything that you should not have. Okay, whether it's a pathogen or just some chemicals that you don't need. The lymph nodes help to filter the lymph. Okay, and so as we look at these lymph pathways, we're going to start with looking at the various vessels that the fluid moves through. The smallest lymph vessel is called a lymph capillary, just like the smallest blood vessel is a blood capillary. It's made up of simple squamous epithelium, just like blood vessels, blood capillaries are. So things can move in it pretty easily. But where a blood capillary has a connection on each end, one end's an arteriole, the other is a venule. In the lymph capillary, it's only connected on one end, so another end is just a dead end. Okay, so that's what that means by closed-ended tube. The fluid that moves into a lymph capillary is the fluid that surrounds your cells, and that fluid is called interstitial or tissue fluid. You can also call it intercellular. Ooh, no, you can't. You can call it intracellular. That's wrong too. Excuse me. Let me start all over. I said it right the first time. Okay. What's the name of the fluid inside your cell? You know, the cytoplasm? That's intercellular fluid. The fluid in between your cells, which is the interstitial fluid, is also referred to as intracellular. Sorry about that. Okay, intracellular fluid. That's another name for interstitial fluid or tissue fluid. Okay, I use the term interstitial fluid a lot. Okay, but that's the fluid that bathes your cells. Okay, and that's what moves in to a lymph capillary from your tissues. And from that point on, it's not called interstitial fluid, it's called lymph. Okay. All right, and then from there, the lymph capillaries join into larger lymph vessels. We just call these lymphatics or lymph vessels. And structurally, they're a whole lot like veins in that they have valves. And those are the ones that empty into lymph nodes. So you've got lymph vessels on either side of a lymph node. We'll see that. Ultimately, it flows into fairly large lymph vessels called lymphatic trunks. And then they, in turn, move the lymph into the largest of the lymph vessels. These are the largest right here. They're called collecting ducts. Of the collecting duct, the thoracic duct is the largest of the two. You have a right lymphatic duct, that's one of your collecting ducts, and then a thoracic duct is the other one. Okay, and so here you can see just an overview of how the lymphatic system structurally is associated with your blood vessels. Okay, so here you've got a bunch of blood capillaries. All right, as fluid moves out to supply your cells with their needs, moves out of the blood, a lot of it's going to move right back in, but that does not moves into a lymph capillary. And then from there it goes through lymph vessels, drains through lymph nodes to other lymph vessels, and ultimately it's going to empty into a blood vessel that's close to the superior vena cava. Okay, so it makes its way back to the bloodstream. So when it's in the blood, it's called blood plasma. When it's bathing your cells, it's called interstitial fluid. And when it gets into a lymph vessel, it's called lymph. It's all kind of the same thing. Do you remember I've told you a drop of blood doesn't stay in one compartment all the time? It's constantly moving. Okay. Okay, so here you can see the shaded area on the top right of the body is in this picture. This is draining into one of the collecting ducts, the right lymphatic duct. So on the slide, 2 slides before this one, it says the right lymphatic duct drains the upper right part of the body. But the thoracic duct, it's the largest of all, it's this one right here. The thoracic duct drains the upper left part plus both sides on the lower part of the body. Okay, so that's why it's the largest of the collecting ducts. Okay, so know what areas of the body the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct drain, and it's typed in there in your notes for you 2 slides before this. Okay. All right, and so here is just that movement of lymph. It's going from lymph capillaries to lymph vessel through the lymph nodes to other lymph vessels and empty into the trunks in there, and then into the collecting ducts and into this subclavian vein. I know you've not named that before, but that's a vein that empties into ultimately the superior vena cava. Okay, so the blood's going to make its way back to the lymph. Excuse me, it's going to make its way into the bloodstream. On the left, you can see a micrograph that's showing a lymph vessel, and you can see the valves in it. They're a lot like the valves. They're exactly like the valves in a vein, just made up of the endothelial cells. Okay, so if we look at this fluid called lymph, it's basically just like tissue fluid in composition. So whatever's bathing your cells can just move into the lymph vessel. And that fluid is a lot like blood plasma. It's just missing some of the proteins that are too big to get out of the bloodstream. Okay. All right. So do you see how the formation of lymph is definitely determined by the tissue fluid formation, the interstitial fluid formation? If it's not there, you're not going to have lymph. So, when I'll tell you what, you stay on this page, and then this next page, and I want to look at a picture that shows this. All right. I like this. I want to look at this picture first. This is from an older book. You have one in your book that looks a lot like this. This just kind of shows it bigger. But what you're seeing in blue are the squamous cells that make up the wall of a lymph capillary. Do you see how they overlap? Okay. And because of that, things can move in pretty easily. But they're like a little swinging door that only opens in one direction. So fluid can move in this way, but if it backs up, it causes that to close off. So fluid can move into the lymph capillary, but it cannot move out of the lymph capillary. So the only place it can go is up towards the lymph vessels. Okay? All right, do you understand then, because of that, because this is almost like a little swinging door, if there's pressure put on it, it's going to open up? All right, do you see that if hydrostatic pressure builds up out here in the tissues, which is due to the presence of the fluid there, the more that pressure is, the more movement of that fluid into the lymph vessel. So the formation of lymph is determined by the fluid pressure out here around your cells. Okay? If this fluid does not move into the lymph vessel, it's going to build up in your cells. It's going to build up and build up and build up, and that's called edema or tissue swelling. Okay? Okay, so if you back up in your notes to this slide, let's say here's in the systemic circuit, here's the blood coming in to a area of your tissues, and substances move out to get not into the cell yet, but bathing the cells, and then that doesn't move back into the bloodstream can move directly into a lymph vessel, and then just keep on going to the other lymph vessels. Okay, so if I back up again, okay, the filtration from the blood plasma, remember I've said more fluid moves out of the bloodstream at the capillary bed than moves back in. About 90% of it moves back in, but 10% doesn't. And it has to do with all those osmotic pressures and everything. So ultimately it builds up in the tissues and literally just spills over into a lymph vessel. And I've probably spent way too long talking about that. If it doesn't move into the lymph vessel, or if enough doesn't move back into the bloodstream, then your tissues will start swelling, and that's fluid edema. Okay? All right. Have any questions on that, on the formation of it? Okay. All right, here's the picture in your book that is like that one. I just kind of like that one. It lays it out a little more simply to me. But do you understand how it can't back up out of the lymph capillary? Because it'll close off the little overlap. So it can only move in one direction, okay, which is a good thing. So that driving force for the movement of lymph is simply the hydrostatic pressure in the tissues, pressure due to all that fluid buildup. And so it causes it to move, Once it's in the lymph vessel, the larger lymph vessels, it can't go backwards because of the valves. Okay, they prevent a backflow, just like in your blood veins. It can't go backwards. So what causes it to move once it gets into the larger lymph vessels out of the capillaries is the same thing that causes blood to move in a vein, which is action of surrounding skeletal muscles. They squish on it, and the presence of the valves prevents a backflow. In the thoracic area, the pressures associated with breathing cause it to move, just like in the blood vessels. And then the larger lymph vessels also have smooth muscles in their walls, so they can constrict a little bit, which helps move that lymph on through. And just remember, the valves keep it from backflowing. And then I've mentioned this before. You see it more than one place in your notes. Edema is just when the tissue, the fluid builds up in your tissues. Okay. So do you see how over time that edema could be real damaging? Because this fluid ultimately came out of your blood, and ultimately it's going to get back to the blood. But if it builds up in your tissues and sits there, it's not going to make its way to the blood again. So do you see how over time that's going to affect blood flow in the body, which can affect blood pressures, which can affect the heart, which can affect the kidneys. It affects everything. Okay? All right, so it's important to get rid of edema if it's occurring. Okay? If you ever took a biology, just a plain biology, or you probably never took a zoology class, but in those kind of courses, sometimes when you're studying all the different organisms, you study about some that are parasites. Have you ever had a class where you studied about worm parasites? You know, we all know about like tapeworm and hookworm and roundworm. Those are some parasites that can get in the digestive tract of a human and cause all kinds of problems. But there is another parasitic worm that can get in the lymph vessels of humans and other, mostly humans, I guess. And if you get bitten by an insect, I don't remember if it's a fly or a species of mosquito, but it's not something that we have around here, thank goodness. But this particular parasite lives its larval stage in the body of some insect, like a little fly. And then if a person gets bitten by that fly or mosquito, then it'll get into the human's body and will go on and develop from the larval stage to maturity, where it will mate and produce eggs that can then be passed. If that insect bites that person again, or another insect bites that person, it can get into that insect's body, and the eggs will hatch and develop into the larval stage. Yeah, see how it cycles? So, in other words, it has two hosts. A lot of parasites are like that. But this particular one, when it gets in a human and it develops out of the larval stage, it migrates to a lymph vessel. And if there's one of them, there's going to be a whole lot of them. And these are macroscopic once they get out of the larval stage. And they can literally clog up a person's lymphatic vessel. So do you see how a side effect of that would be fluid edema? Because it'll block a lymph vessel. And that edema is especially evident in extremities of the body, like arms, legs, the breast, the scrotum. And those areas engorge with fluid and get real large. You see it a whole lot in the legs if a person is infected by it. And the condition is called elephantiasis. You ever heard of elephantiasis? Because the legs swell up and they get big like elephant legs. And over time, scar tissue develops and it's a permanent enlargement. Thank goodness there's good drugs that can kill it at the larval stage so it never develops into maturity. And I'm sure surgically they can remove the big ones. But it's weird. It's a worm parasite that lives in somebody's lymphatic system. So it shows you how important this flow of lymph is, because if you don't have it, tissues are going to swell. It's weird, isn't it? Go look up elephantiasis. It's a type of filarial worm. If you've heard of different kind of worm parasites, it's a filarial worm. But anyway, all right, that's enough on lymph vessels. Now we're going to look at the lymph nodes. These are the most numerous organs of the lymphatic system. They're little small little structures, just a few, centimeter or two in length. They're somewhat bean shaped, so they have an indentation on one surface, like a kidney bean. And the whole purpose of a lymph node is to filter lymph. All right, and so if we look at the parts of one, you can see different regions of it here. I want to move to a picture of it. Here you can, you notice inside the lymph node these clusters. These are some clusters of lymphocytes. And the whole reason the lymphatic system is called the lymphatic system is because it has organs that house lymphocytes. Okay, there are lots of lymphocytes that reside in lymphatic organs, and they're in various places within these organs. But one real special area in a lymph node is called a lymphatic nodule. So that's a nodule. And lymph nodes are loaded with lymphatic nodules. A lymphatic nodule is just an aggregation of a bunch of lymphocytes. There's some other cells there too, but in the lymphatic system, there are lymphatic cells, lymphocytes, and also some macrophages, which are some phagocytes. All right, but many of the macrophages are in the medulla. So you have these nodules, and then in the center you've got this area of the medulla. But do you see the incoming lymph? It comes in by way of afferent. Afferent means towards. Afferent lymph vessels. And then it flows through here. And then macrophages and lymphocytes can act on any foreign things that might be in that lymph. And so then it comes out of the lymph node by way of the efferent or efferent lymph vessels. And now it's cleaned up a little bit. Okay. The outer covering is just a fibrous capsule. Anyway, okay. So here you see it again. Here and there on the right, you can see it through the microscope. So here are these lymphatic nodules. Okay. Don't worry about the germinal center of it. Don't worry about that. Just know the whole thing is a nodule. Okay. Okay. And a lymph node has a lot of little lymphatic nodules within it. Okay. You have various functions of the lymph node, filtering because of the macrophages, and then they work with the immune system. So we'll understand that more at the last half of the chapter when we look at the immune response. But the immune response is conducted by macrophages and various lymphocytes. Together, they work together to cause you to have body defense against specific foreign antigens. Right. Lymphocytes not only reside in the lymph nodes, they also can divide in the lymph nodes. So these are organs that can produce more lymphocytes for you. Okay. They're everywhere in the body, except in your central nervous system. You have another body protection at the central nervous system that has to do with the blood vessels there. It's called the blood-brain barrier. And then you also have some microglial cells, which are phagocytic cells in the central nervous system. But you have lymph nodes that help fight infections all over the body. We tend to have some that are aggregated in specific areas, like you've got cervical lymph nodes, that would be in the neck. The axillary lymph nodes are in the armpit. Remember all these different areas? You don't have to memorize the different areas. Don't worry about naming the areas for me. I've just got this on here so you can see that they are in some specific areas where you have clusters of them. All right. If you are fighting an infection of the body, local lymph nodes where the infection is going on are going to work overtime. And as they do, they might enlarge because they're producing more of the lymphocytes in there. And sometimes we refer to that as a swollen gland. Like if you have a respiratory infection, your cervical lymph nodes might swell up. People mistakenly call that a gland. They're not glands. They're lymph nodes. But you'll feel them larger in your neck area. Sometimes, let's say if somebody has cancer and they're having surgery to remove the tumor, they always are also removing some of the lymph nodes that are close to the tumor. Like if a woman has breast cancer, they might even remove some of the axillary lymph nodes, because one of the characteristics of cancer cells is diapedesis. It can move in and out of the bloodstream, but it also can move into a lymph node. So if it moves into a lymph node, it can land, or in a lymph vessel, it can land in a lymph node. And they look at that under the microscope to see if cancer cells are there. And if they're not, that's an indication that that cancer hasn't metastasized or spread yet. And they may just treat it surgically and not do much else, because they got it all. But if they do find cancerous cells in those local lymph nodes, that's an indication that it has spread or proof that it is spreading. And so they may do some further treatments, radiation, chemotherapy. So anyway. All right. And then some other areas of the body that you have lymphatic nodules. Remember, a nodule is that a special cluster of lymphocytes inside the lymph node. Okay, you have individual nodules in other places of the body. One place is in the lining of the small intestine. It's called a Peyer's patch, which is wonderful because a lot of pathogens' first entrance into your body is by being absorbed through the wall of the digestive tract. So here you've got a little defense area called a Peyer's patch, just little lymphatic nodules. They're microscopic. The nodules are microscopic. Your tonsils, you've all heard of tonsils. Those are lymphatic organs that are made up of a bunch of lymphatic nodules, and it's not as smoothly enclosed like a little tiny lymph node is. They're bigger than lymph nodes, but they're located in your pharynx. And so that's another first entry as those pathogens are coming in by way of your respiratory system or your digestive system through the mouth. So if you breathe it or eat it, your tonsils can help take care of that. Sometimes they get infected and they swell up, and because of their location, that can interfere with with air movements in your upper respiratory tract. So sometimes you have to have those removed. But you have a lot of other lymphatic areas of the body. That's why you can live without some of your tonsils. Okay, your appendix. You've heard of your appendix. It's kind of like the tonsils, but it's connected to your large intestine, which is where a lot of pathogens could be. So, then another lymphatic organ is your thymus gland. And we studied the thymus gland as an endocrine organ. Do you remember it's in the mediastinum just above the heart? It's an endocrine organ because it produces a hormone called thymosin. And it's a lymphatic organ because a lot of lymphocytes live inside the thymus gland. And the thymosin, the hormone, influences the development of one of the two major categories of lymphocytes. We're going to see later in this chapter that you have T lymphocytes and you have B lymphocytes. And early in your existence as a little fetus, there's no distinction between a T and a B lymphocyte. They're not as differentiated yet. But early in your development, some of them are influenced by thymosin, and those go on to become the T cells or the T lymphocytes, which provide some types of body defense for you, and then the B cells provide another type. Okay, and we'll see later on, but they work together for body defense. All right. Okay, and so there you see the thymus gland right here. Don't confuse it with thyroid gland up above it. Okay, thyroid gland's in the neck, thymus gland is in the mediastinum. And it's that strange organ that is larger the younger you are, smaller the older you are. We've talked about that earlier. Okay. And then the spleen. I love the spleen. Everybody knows we've got one. We all know it's bad if it ruptures, but probably most people couldn't tell you what it did. How many of you know what the spleen does, what it's for? It's a bizarre organ. But the reason it's considered a lymphatic organ is because it houses lymphocytes. It has nodular areas within it. Okay, it's up under the diaphragm on the left side of the upper abdominal cavity, and it has little lobules in it, and it has nodular areas that have a lot of lymphocytes. But it's not lymph that's moving through it, it's blood. So the spleen does for the blood what a lymph node does for the lymph. Okay? So that's one of its functions, is that it filters blood. But as the blood passes through the spleen, it can sit there for a while because it's got spaces that can hang on to the blood. So that's why we say it acts also as a blood reservoir. That's why it's really bad if it's ruptured, because you're going to bleed out, or you bleed in, I guess. because you've got a lot of, if you have a little extra blood, it can be housed at the spleen. Okay. You can live without a spleen because your hormones like erythropoietin and other growth factors that affect your bone marrow can regulate the production of your blood cells. So you can live without it. And because you have another major blood filtering organ called the liver, you don't have to have that function. You can survive without a spleen. Okay, so you can imagine if it acts as a blood reservoir, let's say if somebody has a spleen issue, they don't go in and fix it, they just remove it, because you can imagine it would be a real high chance of somebody bleeding too much if they go in and try to surgically repair a spleen because there's so much blood inside of it. Okay, and because you can live without it, they just remove it. There's two fairly famous tissues found in the spleen, and for once it's got easy names: red pulp and white pulp. The white pulp is like the little nodules in a lymph node. It's made up of a bunch of white blood cells. And the red pulp is the reservoir area. It's where a lot of red blood cells are. So that's easy. Okay, and so here you can see a picture of the spleen. And you can see as the blood flows into it through the splenic artery. Okay, do you see? Here's the reservoir area, so that would be the red pulp. And then these are the little nodules. That would be some white pulp, white pulp, white pulp. Okay, and then this is from an older book. It just shows it a little bit bigger. This is from your book. But again, you can see there's the red pulp and the white pulp. And under the microscope, it looks quite a bit. It's kind of hard for me to distinguish it unless you look at it super close and see those red cells. It looks at first glance a lot like a lymph node. Okay. But you can see the nodular areas right here. That'd be the white pulp because it's got white blood cells in it. Okay. Now, so we've looked at these various lymph organs. Some of these are associated with many tracts of the body. All these tracts, digestive, urinary, reproductive, respiratory, these tracts are lined with a mucous membrane. And that mucus is there as a protection. It's one of these first lines of defense for you. And a lot of those areas have lymphatic organs associated with them, like the ones I've just talked about, like tonsils, the appendix, the Peyer's patch, and the small intestine. You won't have that term on your test, but I just want you, I've put this slide up here to show you that you've got lymphatic areas all over the body. It's not just the little lymph nodes. Okay, you've got lots of other ones. And then you have the ones that sometimes we consider the true lymphatic organs, which are totally enclosed. They're macroscopic, totally enclosed by a capsule, like the lymph nodes, the thymus, and the spleen. Okay. Okay. All right. Now the rest of this chapter is devoted to the defense functions of the lymphatic system. And we have to have defensive functions as an organism because our outer world has pathogens in it. A pathogen is simply any disease-causing agent. Okay, that's different from an antigen. At first time students encounter all this terminology, they think pathogens and antigens are the same thing. An antigen is a chemical that triggers someone to produce antibodies. Okay? Antigens can be found on the surface of the cells of pathogens. Okay, but a pathogen could be a bacterial cell, a viral particle, protozoans, fungus, like athlete's foot is a fungus. Okay? Ringworm is a fungus. It causes a disease. It's a pathogen. Okay. And we fight these pathogens in two basic ways. One is more of a general defense, meaning like your skin. Your skin is fighting a whole lot of things at the same time. It's fighting bacteria. It helps prevent bacteria from entering it. because it's so thick. It's not specific to a particular bacterium or virus. It's just everything. Okay, that would be a general type of defense. Adaptive defense. This is what the immune system is known for, um, and that's where your body produces chemicals which fight specific foreign antigens. Okay? An antigen is just a chemical that can be found on pathogens. An antigen is just any chemical, regardless of where it's located. If it causes you to produce antibodies against it, it's called an antigen, a foreign antigen. We talked about that in the last unit a little bit when we were doing the blood group antigens. Okay. So today I want us to just look at the innate defenses, and then next time we'll focus on immunity, which is the adaptive or specific defenses. Okay, so look at the non-specific, general, innate defenses. I've listed several of these. The fact that you are a human being causes you to have what we call species resistance. Can you think, let's think about like your dogs. There is a devastating disease that dogs can get. It's a parasitic infection that you never see in humans. Can you think of it? Heartworm. Heartworm's kind of like that little filaria worm I was telling you about that can cause elephantiasis, where it lives part of its life cycle in an insect and part then in the vertebrate, like the dog. The heartworm larva lives in the salivary glands of the mosquitoes that live around here. Okay, so if a dog gets bitten by that mosquito, the larva then moves into the dog's bloodstream and can make its way to his heart, where it grows to maturity and literally can clog up the heart. And they're very large worms, and they can destroy the action of the heart in a dog. All right, and in the heart is where those worms mate and produce eggs that then get into the bloodstream. So if another mosquito comes along and bites that infected dog, then the eggs get into that mosquito's little body, and they hatch and go to the larval stage where they live in its salivary gland. You see how it cycles all the time? Okay. You get bitten by those same mosquitoes, and the larvae get in you. But somehow or another, we are just programmed so that those larvae can't make their way to maturity in us. Okay? And so we have species resistance against heartworms. Okay, but I imagine there's diseases we have that dogs don't get. There are plant diseases that we don't get, and vice versa. All right, and that's just because we have species resistance. So that's one of your non-specific defenses. You've got a lot of mechanical barriers. I mentioned the skin and the various mucous membranes of the body. They prevent entrance by a lot of pathogens, a lot of different kinds of pathogens, not just one. And then you have a whole lot of different chemical barriers. For example, when you eat, you have enzymes in your digestive tract that are designed to break down food, like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, but they're also breaking down some of the molecules in these pathogens that you might ingest. Okay, and so that would be an example. In your tears, you have an enzyme that fights bacteria. Not one kind of bacteria, lots of bacteria, to help prevent bacterial infections of the eye. It's called lysozyme. It's in your tears. You have chemicals produced by cells that are infected by a viral particle, and these chemicals are called interferons, and they prevent another one of your cells from being infected by viruses. So they kind of help prevent viral infections. Do y'all know what viruses even are, by the way? If I told you, all know that they can be bad, they can cause disease. A lot of viruses are pathogens for us. But would it surprise you if I told you that a virus cannot be placed in any of the kingdoms of organisms, because a virus is not an organism? You know how you have the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, the fungus kingdom, the protozoan, the protist kingdom, and then the bacterial kingdom. Well, viruses don't fit anywhere. all a virus, what a virus is, it's just two kinds of molecules. It's a nucleic acid, like DNA, some of them are RNA, and then it's got some proteins around it. So there's no cell membrane, there's no organelles, it's just a nucleic acid with a protein coat. All right, and by itself, that can't hurt you. All right, but if it gets in you, and let's say here's one of your body cells. Believe it or not, you have receptors for certain viruses. And so let's say if a virus, that's a little virus, that's the DNA inside. And I haven't drawn it to scale. That virus is really a lot smaller than this picture is showing you. But that nucleic acid can get inside the host cell, and it uses all of the host cell machinery to replicate itself. So it uses the enzymes, DNA polymerase. It uses the host cell's enzymes and it uses the host cell's nucleotides to produce new DNA molecules. So now you got a bunch of viral DNA molecules in here. And then remember how DNA has a bunch of genes in it? Those genes on the viral DNA are the genes that code for the proteins that make up this protein coat of the virus. But it can't do anything. It can't make proteins unless it makes a messenger RNA. But it requires nucleotides for that, certain enzymes for that. So it's using the host cells to do that, to make messenger RNAs that then go to the host cells' ribosomes, and the host cells transfer RNAs, bring up new amino acids to produce little viral proteins. So basically, the virus just replicates itself inside the host cell. And in the meantime, that host cell's normal actions cease. And that's how it can destroy the host cell. Eventually, that host cell will burst open, it dies, and it causes these little viral particles to go infect other cells. Okay, well, a cell that is already infected by a virus produces these things called interferons, and I'm not going to go into any kind of depth on it at all, but they basically help prevent other cells from getting infected by viruses. Okay. All right, complement is another set of proteins that's even more confusing than interferons, in my opinion, but complement with an E, not an I. But these are some proteins that can be found in your blood, and if they get activated, they can trigger some things that help fight pathogens, like inflammation. They can enhance phagocytosis. So in the presence of complement proteins, phagocytes are more active. Okay. All right, so those are just a few examples of some chemical barriers. Then you have some lymphocytes that actually produce chemicals that infect a variety of cells, not just one kind of foreign thing, but a variety. And they're called your natural killer cells. I love those. Inflammation is a whole nother set of events. We've talked about inflammation before, right? And inflammation helps prevent spread of pathogens, so it contains it in that area. Phagocytes are attracted to inflamed areas, so they can eat up the pathogens. Phagocytosis by itself is a big deal in the body. Your major phagocytes are your neutrophils and your monocytes in the blood. But monocytes that get out of the blood become macrophages. And so those are major tissue phagocytes. And the combination of these phagocytes in the body, especially the monocytes and the macrophages, that's referred to as your reticuloendothelium. That's just kind of all the phagocytes of the body are referred to as the reticuloendothelium. Fever, elevation of body temperature, can affect the cell division of bacteria to help prevent them from exploding in the body. That fever could possibly denature some of the proteins of the pathogen. So you have lots of defense mechanisms that are not considered immunity, the immune part of the immune response. You have a lot of non-specific, and so that's what this is showing you. Your book might go into this in a little more depth, but that's what you'll be tested on with them. Okay, be able to to just very briefly explain each of these. Okay? All right, next time we're going to spend all of our time on immunity, which is the specific defense. Okay? So that's all we're going to do today.